Greetings, everyone. I'd like to welcome you from wherever you may be coming to us from, across the United States, Canada, perhaps even Iceland. The Icelandic National League of the United States is proud to present another in our Author's Corner series, today by welcoming Solveig Eggerz, author of Sigga of Reykjavík. Before we get started, I've got just a few short announcements and some logistics things I'd like to cover. First of all, we invite you to visit our website at www.inl.org to see our calendar of events that includes some fine upcoming events. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, October 24th, and features professional food photographer and fellow Western Icelander Rhonda Adkins, something you won't want to miss. And also keep an eye out for our next series of Icelandic language classes that will begin in October and run for 6 weeks that will be available to all INLUS members. You can check that out again on our website or watch for more information on our Facebook page. Regarding today's author's chat with Solveig, everyone is muted today and won't be visible to each other here on the Zoom platform. But we really invite you to ask questions. And you can ask questions by, at the bottom of your screen, hovering over and seeing the Q&A button. So at any time at all during the presentation today, if you have questions, just type in your question there and it'll come to me and I'll put the questions in queue. And when we reach that point, we will read those questions over to Solveig. And lastly, I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to Alicia Bjornsson from New Jersey, who told us about Solveig and this wonderful book and helped make the introductions and make today possible. So thank you, Alicia. So let me just introduce Solveig really quick. She is a native of Iceland, and she published her first novel entitled Seal Woman in 2008 with Ghost Road Press, and it won a first prize in fiction from the Maryland Writers Association. Solveig earned her PhD degree in comparative literature from Catholic University in Washington, D.C., and has a distinguished career teaching research and writing skills, including a master's degree program with the Department of Defense. Now, her ancestry is a little bit illustrious. Her grandfather was one of the first Icelandic premiers in Iceland, and her father, Pétur Eggerz, was a best-selling author in Iceland. And I'm happy to introduce his daughter today, who seems like she's on her own similar path, becoming an author in her own right. So let's hear from Solveig. And with that, I'd like to just kind of start off with a question for her. What caused you to write this particular book?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, David. What in the world caused me to write this book? It was a little mixed up. It was not a direct approach to writing this book. Rather, I was visiting my parents for decades in Iceland in the 1980s and 1990s. Either one or the other were living in Iceland, and I was living here in Alexandria, Virginia. So I would go there and bring my children, and I would always be studying Icelandic history, whatever I could find on the shelf about Icelandic history, especially in the 20th century. And there were certain things that struck me. One that just really captured my imagination, because I was working as a writer here and working for a newspaper, and so I was, had an eye out for things like this. First of all, first thing that struck me was that Jewish refugees went to Iceland in the late 1930s to escape from Hitler. They came through Copenhagen. Iceland was almost a colony of Denmark at that time, and Denmark was not taking any more refugees, Jewish refugees. They protected their own, but sent others on their way. And they said, "Why don't you go to Iceland?" And so that's how they ended up coming to Iceland. And I was working on Jewish topics in my work in Alexandria, so that really struck me. And I soon as I read that, I actually thought I would love to write a book about this. I'd like to write a book with the Jewish refugee at the center. And I actually did, but I then changed it totally and ended up with Sigga. The other topic that really captured me was the Allied occupation of Iceland in World War II. And I think it was, you know, a so-called friendly occupation, although some people called it an invasion. The Icelanders never wanted it. It happened May 10, 1940, and they had told Churchill, we don't want you, but he came anyway. And I think they were glad that it was the British and not the Germans at that time, but Iceland always wanted to be neutral. And so for one thing, they wanted to do business with the British and the Germans, selling fish. They also feared the Germans. The Germans were very threatening. The German consul there, who worked directly for Heinrich Himmler, that's a whole nother topic. There's a whole book on that, on how Heinrich Himmler actually planted one of his men in the consulate there to build up favorability and fear among the Icelanders. So, you know, he would go to the newspapers and make sure they weren't writing anything negative about Germany and so forth. So there was that fear. And therefore, the Icelanders always wanted to have this official position of neutrality. And the other reason for that was that Iceland at that time, well, the whole first half of the 20th century, Iceland was in the process of breaking away from the Danish crown. And they had plans. They were at the time of the occupation in 1940, Iceland was just 3 years away from the expiration of the agreement, their personal union agreement under the Danish monarch was set to expire in 1943, at which time Iceland intended to become a republic and have nothing more to do with the king. But the Icelanders viewed this as a complicating factor, having thousands of foreign troops come in, and they feared they'd never get their full independence. So that's why they resisted. But Churchill was not about to go along with that. And as some of you may know, that this starts in going back to April 9, 1940. On that day, Hitler invaded Norway and he occupied Denmark. So it was a friendly occupation. As soon as that happened, that occupation, Churchill was nervous, you know, that Iceland and the Faroe Islands would be taken next. That would just be like dessert, because they were both semi-colonies of Denmark at the time. So that's when he started making plans. And in fact, by April 11th, he had already occupied the Faroe Islands. And for those of you who are into geography, the Faroe Islands are very small islands, sort of between Iceland and the UK, right there in the ocean there between those, if you can envision it. So that went well. The Faroese didn't have time to oppose this idea, but the Icelanders kept saying, no, we don't want you. And then May 10, 1940, about 4:30 a.m. or something around that time. It was already broad daylight, because it's the land of the midnight sun. And people were aware of some activity going on. People left over from the night before, people who had been out celebrating were, you know, aware that there was destroyers out in the outer harbor. Iceland at this time was almost totally isolated. There were no airports, and there was limited seafaring activity except for the trawlers. And you know, a couple of passenger ships too. But to see 4 destroyers bristling out on the outer harbor really awakened some attention. And before long, lots of people were down on the harbor. And they did not know, they were not informed. They didn't know, the officials didn't know whether it was Germans or British that were coming. It wasn't until, you know, they have these little boats that you get into, and then you come into the inner harbor. It wasn't until the soldiers started actually stepping onto the dock and started saying, "Blimey, where are the polar bears?" And then I think a lot of people jumped up in the air with joy when they realized it was the British and it was not the German invasion, which could just as well have happened. So on that same day, May 10th, 1940, all you history buffs, Hitler invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. And Winston Churchill, who was at that time the Lord of the Admiralty, maybe it is, he became prime minister. And he viewed as his job from that moment on to get Franklin Roosevelt into the war. And as you probably know, the FDR was up against all the isolationists in the US. And Britain was just about to expire already. I mean, they were so threatened. And what was particularly threatened was the British lifeline, which is the string of boats and ships that travel in convoy from other parts of the world to Britain, bringing food and all the supplies that they required in order to survive. So I found that fascinating, that because what happened very quickly then, as soon as the Brits had landed in Iceland, they started, well, Iceland was on the map now for the Germans, for one thing. And Churchill knew that, and he needed Iceland strategically. So he pestered and pestered Roosevelt until Roosevelt finally agreed to send troops to Iceland in July 1941, almost a little more than a year later. And so all of you people who think that the US entered the war at Pearl Harbor, it really entered at Iceland. Because as soon as the US troops were there, they were, of course, all over the country, but they also had an anchorage in the fjord, the very deep fjord called Hvalfjörður, or Whale Fjord, has a very narrow neck. And it's possible to create a little undersea fence there so that you can have your destroyers and everything else safe deep in the fjord. And that's what started happening. There were all these Allied ships that were in that anchorage. The Hood was there, which was shot down by the Bismarck not long after that. And so if you just use your imagination, once you have these boats here and all these soldiers, Americans, in addition to the British, they were supposed to relieve the British, but everybody's kind of stayed for a while. They started supporting the convoys that were going to Britain. So there was deep involvement here on the part of the US. But the isolationists kept saying, no, stay out, we're staying out, we're staying out. And Hitler had sent out this edict, okay, we are never, ever, ever to shoot or hit a US vessel. That is forbidden. But these US boats were always dodging around, and some British boats in the convoy. This is October 17, 1941. So we're still not at Pearl Harbor. And some British boats in the convoy were hit by U-boats. And you see, Iceland is completely involved in this war. It's called the Battle of the North Atlantic. And then they sent out, the Americans sent out 3 destroyers, including the USS Kearney, to assist. Deep involvement in the war here. And the Kearney goes, okay, you're signaling.
Well, I was just going to say this is really fabulous historical context, and I could listen to all of it because you've got such great detail. You had originally said that your book was going to focus around one of the Jewish immigrants or one of the Jewish refugees, but your book instead focuses around a woman, a girl who starts off Sigga.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of like shift a little bit to talk about Sigga's
Thank
life?
Thank you for reining me in. Thank you for pulling me back. But just let me finish the sentence, and that is that the USS Kearney dropped depth charges on U-boat, and then the Kearney was torpedoed. That killed 11 Americans, and that started turning the tide. So that's when they started, the isolationists started softening, and they said, now we're in a shooting war, aren't we? But we weren't, not until Pearl Harbor. Yeah, so I had, and his name was Fritz, and I imagined this fellow coming, this Jewish refugee coming, and he was of course very well educated. He's coming from Berlin. He's been at the university working there, but he gets a job in a margarine factory in Iceland, and he is always threatened by deportation because there was just a handful of these Jewish refugees in Iceland, and actually several of them were sent back. And that's not, one of our greatest moments in Icelandic history. They were sent back to unknown, probably horrible consequences. And the way this was done was that everyone was given a residence permit, but for only 6 months, and then it expired. And usually you didn't pay any attention to that expiration, but if someone was being a little irritating or something, then you could point to the expiration of the residence visa and deport them. Anyhow, so my character Fritz was very nervous about that, and he meets this Icelandic woman named Sigga from the farm. But I realized that his viewpoint for me was too narrow. He was coming from Germany, and all I could do was show what he experienced. I needed someone who could because as I learned more and more about what was happening in Iceland, I wanted a larger scope of history represented. I knew that I needed to choose the female character who was coming from the farm to be central. So I rewrote the book then, and started it with Sigga, who was on a farm, and she was born in 1908, and so we meet her when she's about 10, so it's about 1918, and she's living on a farm under surf-like conditions. And I had researched that and discovered that the life on the farm was not as idyllic as I had experienced it, when I visited the farm. It could be pretty awful. And so she was always trying to get away. But I wanted to bring that in and let people know about that. And my character then escapes from the farm. That is, it's a pretty negative circumstances that lead to her being sent away from the farm. And she starts working as a maid in a house, and she was working in a house in one of the houses right behind me. So I am sitting now, let's pretend, this is a photograph of the pond at the center of Reykjavik, and the word for pond is tjörn, and the street that runs along the pond is Tjarnargata, or Pond Street. So behind my back is Tjarnargata. And these were all rather expensive, large homes. and the traditional style corrugated iron. So she goes and becomes a maid in one of those houses for a Danish merchant named Rasmussen. And that was a huge step upward to become a maid, because now you have a salary, you have electricity, nice running water, you know, a lot of comforts, good food. And yeah, and you literally, you have money of your own to spend. So it's a huge act of, it's like the beginning of independence, becoming a maid. So yeah, anyhow, that, so I was fascinated by this involvement in World War II. And I thought that for a young woman like that, coming to Reykjavik, she moves to Reykjavik in 1924, when Iceland was in deep economic depression. So she's fine as long as she's a maid working for these rather wealthy people. But as soon as she becomes pregnant, life changes. And she has to leave. And she has to marry someone. And she faces grinding poverty, the grinding poverty that so many people faced in Reykjavik at that time. But there's evidence of the war all around. Even someone like Sigga, who's working in the fish plant, you know, salting and drying fish. The ocean is all around. And if you just walk along the shore, you can see wreckage from boats. A lot of Icelandic trawlers went down. This is during the time when the economy is shifting away from agriculture and towards fishing. So you could always find a lot of debris from ships, literal physical signs of this warfare that was going on under the ocean most of the time. So let's see, what else can I tell you about Sigga? Well, of course, Fritz stays in the book because he is the romantic interest, but that comes later in the book after we deal with husband, marriage, and things like that. Yeah. Did you want to ask a question?
From a lot of your I just see from a lot of your reader comments online that they really love Sigga, even though a lot of us maybe can't relate to all the poverty and the hardship that she went through. And I think you're just giving us a tiny taste of that part of your story right now. But it seems like she goes through a lot, but yet your readers just find such courage in her. Can you describe kind of a little more of that courageous side of Sigga? Where does she get it?
Yeah, well, I played with the idea that Sigga is an angry woman, and that there is power in her anger. So she's been abused on that farm. Her mother was very cowardly and weak because the mother was afraid they would just be thrown out. But there were men who were touching her as when she was a child and later as a teenager, and she had this reservoir of anger. And she built up her strength, lifting calves. On the first page of the book is a description of how she lifted a calf every day, and he grew bigger, and she lifted, so she was always lifting more and more weight. But her purpose was, and this is when she's 10 years old, her purpose was to be so strong that she can just knock a man over. So she's got that strength, and she's got this anger, and she's got this desire for independence, and it builds up in her. And on the farm, like they did at least before television, they would always have an evening reading aloud. And sometimes they would read poetry, sometimes they would sing, sometimes they would just read one chapter at a time of various books. And so Sigga was acquainted with the Icelandic sagas, actually. And there's some powerful women in those sagas that she probably subconsciously modeled herself on. She was just going to survive. And she loved her mother, but she had a little bit of disdain for the mother too, because the mother wouldn't fight back, but she was determined to fight back.
I don't want to shift too soon away from this story, but I recognize that from your first book, which is called Seal Woman, it also has a really strong female lead character that has gone through a lot of torture in her life. Is there something between these two characters, a thread, a life lesson thread that you're trying to convey to the readers? What are we to learn from these strong characters?
Yeah, well, there's, and the character in Seal Woman, Charlotte, so she is one of these women post-war. The men have been killed and there's no food and there's no work in Germany. And she just has to do something to save herself. And so the historic fact is that the farmers in Iceland, because now so many women were moving to Reykjavik, they were advertising, they needed women on the farms because the women basically ran the farms. There was just so much indoor work and management that every farm needed a woman. And so they made this arrangement. This was with the consul in Lübeck to place advertisements around the cities in Germany, farm workers needed. And so, Charlotte is one of these women that goes on a boat to Iceland to work on a farm. So in my view, that only the strongest, most courageous people would do that, would just go off to Iceland to work on a very primitive farm. So there's that. The character in Seal Woman is less outspoken than Sigga. She buries a lot of it inside herself, a lot of her pain, because she's misplaced a child. So many children were misplaced. She hid her child and couldn't find the child, and so she's suffering psychologically. Sigga is totally externalized. It's all just says it, that. So she's much more, and she's quite explosive. So in that sense, they're quite different.
Okay, that's great. We do have one really interesting question that's come from one of our audience members today, and I'll just read it out here. It says, I love the historical fiction presented in Sigga of Reykjavík. Sigga has such strong opinions about Iceland's independence and freedom. How does her decision to work in a corset factory lead to liberation when corsets are so restrictive?
Thank you for that question. I love that you caught the irony. Well, the whole corset thing is, I just had to put that in there. Actually, my grandmother's sister founded the corset shop in 1916 in Reykjavik, and it still exists. So Sigga wants good, clean work. And it's just a coincidence because she was always snooping around in the farm, reading every scrap of newspaper. She was always trying to inform herself about what's going on in Reykjavik because she's way off on this farm. And the farm wife, wrapped her porcelain in old pieces of newspaper. Sigga was always peeling it away. And that's when she found this advertisement from the corset shop. And it's something that I had seen in my research. Corset making instruction offered at the corset shop. That was her goal, was to go and learn how to make those corsets. And that was a dream deferred, but she never lost that dream. Instead, her hands got very, very swollen from all of that work washing fish in ice cold water and being outdoors all the time in that difficult climate, but she really wanted to be inside just stitching and with very clean fingernails.
So that decision for the corset factory was an intentional kind of reverse focus of her outward expression.
Yes, she really thought she could become independent by stitching the women up into tight, and all the other women into these tight garments.
Perhaps she longed for that herself, to kind of restrain herself from her over emotiveness.
Well,
who knows?
But her opportunity comes with the money. So the occupation, May 10, 1940, snapped Iceland out of the Depression, and money started flowing then. And as soon as money started flowing, women started buying corsets or having them made for themselves. And they just needed a lot of people to do those, to sew those corsets, and Sigga was available.
So you've written two really powerful books that are historical fiction focused around women. Do you have a third in mind? Are you staying in this genre?
I am not. No, I'm not writing about Iceland right now. But I am writing a novel, and it's not historical fiction. It's I don't know. Maybe it's it's about a young woman who's pretty powerful,
Okay.
making her way. But she lives here. She lives in this country. She lives in Virginia, in fact. So, but there's a lot of Italy in it too, through her mother. So, yeah.
Nice.
So, but I'm working on that I'm working on that every day. So I'm deeply involved in that one now.
And people that would like to purchase these two books around Iceland, where would they go?
So you mean the books about Iceland?
The Sigga book and Seal Woman.
Yeah, so the easiest way is just Amazon, just to go to Amazon. Probably you can get Seal Woman probably at a very good price these days. You can also go to your independent bookstore and order. I've been doing that just to support the independent stores, and just, I order books by friends there, and that, I'm trying to keep them alive, those stores. These books, both of these books are available in Icelandic. And I was in Iceland in 2018 when Sigga came out in Icelandic. So if you're interested in that, you can just order them through Amundsen. That's the big bookstore in Iceland.
Okay.
Yeah. What else can I tell you? Are there any other questions?
Well, there's no more questions from the audience, but I'm kind of curious about your teaching. You're obviously a good writer, and you've come from a family where writing is respected, honored. Teaching people how to write successfully and to do research around that writing. What are some of the things that you teach your master's students in that respect?
Oh yeah, I'm not doing that anymore. Now I worked for Department of Defense for 12 years, and it was all about editing and teaching people how to write. So I was both doing the editing and also helping people write basically what were arguments. I mean, in other words, nonfiction argument using the argumentative style. So I had been trained in that at Catholic University, the old rhetorical style of argument, and that worked very well for me in teaching people how to make an argument. But that's not what I do now. I usually teach creative writing. And most people, in my experience, I do this for the Writer Center in Bethesda, and I also do work in detention centers in Virginia. And almost everybody wants to write something personal. Very few, I tried to make it available, the skills available for fiction and nonfiction both, but I've learned that almost everybody is very interested in writing their own story. So now how can and your question was, how do you go about teaching? I don't think you can teach anybody how to write. all you can do is you can help them unleash the creativity that resides within them. Help them to find that story, and help them to find what's interesting about the story and what others might enjoy. I taught a little class last night about a new method that I'm using, which is called draw before you write. And I have a tremendous respect for the imagination and the memory, but these remain elusive to us often. We're so busy just getting through the day and remembering passwords and things like that, that we need a lot of help with making the connection between the head or the heart and let's just say the paper or the computer. Mm-hmm. It's that you need a bridge, and drawing is a bridge. Like stick figures or just something that helps you calm down and relax and allow those memories to come to you, and also to envision what you're doing.
To remove the corset of our life a bit.
to loosen the corset.
There you go. We have one more question from one of our audience members, and it's kind of a historical perspective question. She'd like to have your comments about the Icelandic women who dated and married American servicemen. Like, what is the culture behind that? I think maybe we think that those women aren't respected very well, or weren't at the time, perhaps. What can you shed light on that?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that. That is one of the things that fascinated me so much about that subject. I got a little sidetracked talking about Hitler and everything else, but you know, this is at the center of the story is what was called the situation, or ástandið. It was a huge problem. I mean, some people say there were as many as 50,000 soldiers. I think it was closer to maybe 30,000. Those statistics have not been fully revealed. But the population of Iceland was only 121,000. And most of the soldiers were in the city of Reykjavik. They were everywhere. And there was so much competition for the women. There was so much anger on the part of the Icelandic men, because the women were excited by these soldiers. They were just, you know, they represented the world. And the soldiers were often very nice, very polite, and they did, you know, they introduced them to jazz and jitterbug, and they brought chocolate and oranges and things like that. So there was a tremendous attraction there. It was just a lot of fun. When you read about it, it just sounds like everyone was just having such a wonderful time. But but there was a lot of opposition to this also. For one thing, there was the violence that was involved. There was the anger on part of the Icelandic men. And there were marriages. There were so many marriages. It wasn't just the loose living. It was, these women were getting married and leaving the country. That was viewed as a tremendous loss. Anyway, there were quite a few who did. There were a lot of pregnancies that did not end up in marriage, but it was just extremely disruptive. And there was a stigma attached to women who went with soldiers. And I think that was the part of the society's way of fighting back and trying to prevent what was happening. But there have been things written by women here, Icelandic women who went to school here. Inga Dóra is one of them. Inga Dóra Björnsdóttir has written very interesting studies on the women who suffered from that stigma, always suffered from that stigma. And so then, you know, they probably never quite got over it. We have a lot of, these women are now, have either passed away or in their late 80s. There are quite a few living here in the Washington area. so it was, and so the stigma, it was not just scandal, it was anger also that drove this. But I read, so I thought this was a terrible thing, you know, and that this was destroying the society, until I picked up which was really a master's thesis in anthropology written by a woman named Herdís Helgadóttir. And the title of it is in Icelandic, Úr hlekkjum, which means out of chains. And this gave me and I went and I interviewed her and found her very interesting. And this gave me a whole new perspective of this, because she describes this as a freeing liberation. It was the coming out of the corset, basically, that when all these soldiers came, these attractive young men. And her theory, and there's a lot of evidence for it, was that women were just so subjugated. Their salaries were very minimal, and they just had very few rights at this time. It was, you know, it was a long way from later what happened in the 70s in Iceland, where women became much, much more liberated, but that was also a struggle. But she basically described this as a positive thing. And I learned from Herdís also about life on the farms, that those little girls were often not treated very nicely. And those women that she interviewed, of course, this was a master's thesis, so she did it as an anthropological study featuring lots of interviews. And those women spoke of the farm not in idyllic terms, but that they had suffered there, and that coming to the city and meeting all these soldiers, oh wow, I'm out of chains. So that the viewpoint is finally changing. Now those poor women are, you know, who suffered from this all their adult lives. I mean, it was probably hard for them to go home to Iceland to visit because of the stigma, but I think now we're seeing it differently. We're seeing it for what it was.
Thank you so much for your time here today. And I cannot wait to go buy both of those books.
Thank you.
And add them to my reading pile. And it's been so enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a great honor to be one of the early writers in the Authors Corner. I know you're launching this, and I hope to see many more authors being featured on INLUS. So all the best to you.
Thanks. Well, we're just a new organization, just about a year old, and hope to keep rolling ahead with good quality programming like this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And you're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.